One thing I've been spending a lot more time doing in 2020 is reading. And though I still don't read as much as I'd like to, which is going to be one of my 2021 resolutions, I have been reading almost daily for the past couple months. I read mostly nonfiction, and I found that, at least for me, when I'm reading nonfiction, it's important for me to have some sort of system for writing down and remembering what I read so I don't have to go back and reread the same books after a couple months or a couple years. So after trying a few recommendations from authors and writers that I admire, I kind of took bits and pieces from each that worked for me to create my own note-taking system for when I'm reading nonfiction books, both for getting more out of what I'm reading and for remembering more of what I read. So I figured I'd share that with you today. For me, this process was kind of twofold. Yeah, on one hand, I wanted to have some sort of reflection or summary that I could look back on in a couple months as a refresher, but I also wanted a process that was going to keep me actively engaged in books and picking out the most important ideas and the ones that apply most to me. Okay, so the first step in this process is just reading actively. So to me, that means highlighting in the book, writing notes in the margins or on Kindle, tying ideas from one book to another book, connecting them to your life in some way, writing down things you agree or disagree with, just basically being more engaged in the book as you're reading it. Some people will argue one way or the other with how much or how little you should be highlighting and taking notes. But for me, I just don't want to overcomplicate it, so I just do it whenever it feels right. And if anything, I opt for maybe overdoing it a little bit right now because I can always distill the points down a little bit later. And then whenever possible, I also have a physical notebook open next to me while I'm reading. I use that to take any longer notes that might not fit in the margins, and then to also write a 1 or 2 sentence summary at the end of every chapter, completely in my own words without looking back at any of what I read. Speaking of this notebook, I highly recommend keeping a journal while you're reading. This can be a digital notebook if you'd like, but I think ideally for me, this is a physical notebook, and then a digital one will come into play a little bit later in the process. So most nonfiction books are split up into parts that are made up of a bunch of different chapters. Some books have much shorter chapters that make up parts that aren't so long. Some have much denser, longer chapters that make up really large parts. Before I read a book, I'll go through and figure out how I'm going to be splitting it up, whether that be into chapters or into parts, and I'll stick with that through the rest of the book. For the sake of this video, I'll just refer to them as sections because sometimes that may be parts and sometimes that may be chapters. So after I'm done one of these sections, I'll go back to the beginning of the section and I'll copy over the highlights and notes that I still think are important into my journal in my own words. There are always things that when I'm reading, I highlight or make a note of because I think they're important, but now that I've reached the end of the section, I realize they're not as important as I thought, and so those won't get copied over into my journal. So the idea here is to be constantly distilling it down to just the most important things. And if you're having a little trouble deciding what to keep and what to get rid of, something I found really helpful for me was, instead of setting some specific criteria for what to keep and what to get rid of, I use resonance as a barometer for deciding that. So I just ask myself what still resonates with me, what resonates with me the most from that section, and those are the things that I'll copy over for my highlights and notes into my journal. So then I do this for the entire book. I'm actively reading, highlighting, and taking notes at the end of sections, going back and doing a review and distilling it down to the most important points and writing a section summary. And then if I set a book down and pick it up a little later, I'll go back and review the section summaries for the last 1 or 2 to get myself back up to speed before I start reading again. And again, when I'm doing all this, I'm trying to do it as much as possible in my own words rather than copying over directly from the book into my journal or into the summaries. And I'm connecting ideas from the book I'm reading to something else I've read or thought about, and developing my own ideas. It's important this is not just an outline of the book, but it's kind of personalized to you. After I finish the book and write my last section summary, I set the book aside for at least a few days and up to a week, and I just let myself think about the ideas in the book, write down anything in my journal that comes to mind, and then after about a week is when that digital version that I mentioned comes into play. I personally use Evernote for this for a few reasons. One, I like their apps both on my iPhone and on my Mac. They have a good search function, which is important to me. And then last but most importantly, I've been using it for a while. All my stuff's already in there. I'm very comfortable with the system. If you already have a system that you use, don't switch for the sake of it. Just stick with it. If you don't, I would recommend Evernote. So at this point, I start a new note on Evernote, And I go back into my journal, starting with the very first section, and I copy over what I'm still finding as important from my journal into the Evernote document. By taking that week off, I've had some time to think about it more, and again, things that I thought were important when I was copying them over into the journal probably aren't as important anymore, and this lets me distill it down and have in Evernote my most important points from the book. And then at the top of the page, I do a 1 or 2 paragraph book summary that I can look back on as a refresher in a couple months, a couple years, to figure out what I thought was most important from that book. So you'll probably notice that through this entire process, I'm doing a lot of writing and rewriting. And for me, this serves a couple purposes. First, since I'm pretty free with how much I highlight and take notes when I'm originally reading, I'm much more strict with what makes it through the second and third pass, which again allows me to distill down to just the most important things. And second, I know there are tools out there for exporting your highlights from a Kindle directly into Evernote, but I found that the process, at least for me, of actually handwriting with pen and paper and reviewing the book again and again allows me to develop more on my thoughts and make connections that I probably wouldn't have made otherwise. And if you find that process of handwriting first and then going and typing things into Evernote too tedious, feel free to skip that, which also leads me to some final thoughts about this whole thing. First, the most important thing is just that you don't overcomplicate it. I'm sure my process is not perfect, it's just what works for me, so I would encourage you to experiment and see what works for you. If your process feels like a chore, you're just not gonna do it, and then it's not worth it. And then second, there is no right or wrong way to do this. All that matters is that you do have a process for doing this so you don't waste your time reading and rereading the same books over and over again, and that you have it stored in a place where you can access it whenever and wherever you need it.